against the Bears, as you see it, as they're inside of this coaching search, what matters? You talk to people all over this league. What matters to them when they're looking at the Bears as a target?
I feel like some of the outside, maybe dysfunction or incompetence that we've seen from the Bears over the last few years, the way that we describe it in Chicago, I don't necessarily know if that's as much of a deterrent to the candidates for a job like this. Earlier in the season, I talked to somebody who they actually are interviewing for the job, and I asked him point blank, I was like, if the Bears were to interview for the head coaching job, would you take it? And he didn't even hesitate to say yes. This is still a legacy franchise. I think that, Ryan Poles, it's been hit or miss with some of the things that he's done, but I feel like you can talk yourself into him as a general manager. He's not actively somebody that's going to scare people off in the way that Trent Baalke is. So are there things that are left to be desired about the way the Bears have operated recently? Yes. But I don't think that the McCaskies are people that are conceived of like Woody Johnson is, where they're boogeymen for people who might take a job like this.
That's interesting because it's not meddling as much as it is sort of weakness. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a kind of an aimless franchise that hasn't necessarily known what they want and why they're making these decisions. And I was talking to my brother about this yesterday, and he asked me, he's like, have the Bears ever hired an offensive-minded head coach who was like the primary play caller for his team before they hired him? And my first thought was like, well, of course they must have, right? And then I look back at every coach they've had since Mike Ditka, and the answer is no, they haven't done that because Matt Nagy was not that for the Kansas City Chiefs. So even if you look at where a lot of these other teams who cycled between coaches have been looking for coaches, the Bears haven't even been able to do that right. So I don't think it's about meddling. I think it's just not understanding the best path forward and having that be a consistent problem.
When George McCaskey says about coaches who might ask for more power and are concerned about the GM, and he says, well, in my experience, they all want the job. How does that strike you? And do you think there are coaches in this cycle who would want more power?
Potentially. And I think more power is always relative, right? Do you want final control? Do you want say over the roster? Or do you want somebody who's going to be heavily involved in roster decisions? And I think, again, that's something where, based on the structure in Jacksonville, for example, over the last few years, there was a pretty distinct disconnect between the front office and how they picked the players and the input that the coaching staff had and how those players were picked. I wouldn't want that if I were a head coach. I would want to make sure that the archetypes I wanted, the play style I wanted, there was a voice in the room for how we built the roster. But I think you can have that without having the sort of power that somebody like a Kyle Shanahan, an Andy Reid, those coach-centric organizations have right now.
I know that you try, like, all 32 teams are your children on that show, but we know that this one's your favorite. You don't have to confirm that, but we know that that's the truth. So I'm curious, from your perspective, Robert.
They've heard him so much, though. I don't know if they're still his favorite.
I know. But from your point of view, where do you think the problems lie with the Bears organizationally? If that's on the field, if that's a coaching issue, if it is a front office issue, where would you prioritize fixing first?
I think it's two different things, and I'm not the first person to have said this. Obviously, misalignment is one of the biggest issues that this team has run into year after year after year, and it's led to competing motivations. I'm not putting this at Ryan Poles, but Ryan Poles didn't draft Justin Fields, and so Ryan Poles' charge is not maximizing Justin Fields. It's getting the Bears roster back to where it needs to get to, and this has happened consistently, where you have head coaches who didn't pick quarterbacks, you have GMs who didn't pick head coaches, and that has been a consistent issue. So I think that's part of it, and that's led to some of these problems. But you can overcome that. And I think the best example for me, look at what happened with the Rams, for example. The Rams, Stan Kroenke has owned the Rams for however, it's been decades, right? And the Rams had issues where they were one of the most forgettable, underachieving teams in the NFL in their last 5-6 years when they were in St. Louis. Les Snead was the general manager of the Rams when Jeff Fisher was there. Sometimes you can overcome all of this with the right coach and the right quarterback. You just have to be shooting high enough to get that transcendent coach. And I think that's been part of the issue, is that it seems like they've been shooting for competency, and the ceiling on these choices have not been high enough to overcome some of the other deficiencies involved with the organization.
That's kind of where I'm at on this, Robert, where I know that the reflex is bring in someone who can put in a floor. And I understand why that reflex is there. I want them to be wowed by a candidate. I don't want them to just sit there and go, well, this guy's okay and he's not going to embarrass us. I want them to take a swing and see if you can find someone who is got potential to be an innovator.
I 100% agree with that. And I think that was my problem, which is the idea of bringing Matt Eberflus back for this season. What's the best case scenario? What was the best thing that was going to happen by bringing him back and trying to, again, they even did the same thing with the offensive coordinator hire, where they went with somebody who had done the job before and had done it, you could argue, at an acceptable level in Seattle. I just think those are half measures that are never going to get you where you want to go, especially in a division where you're having to compete against these guys who are true difference makers at the head coaching spot. And, we'll see what happens with Detroit when they have to move on from Ben Johnson and Aaron Glenn, and you have to restock the cupboard. That's always the problem and one of the potential downsides with these CEO type head coaches, but no such concerns in Green Bay or Minnesota. Like Kevin O'Connell and Matt LaFleur are going to be there being definitively positive multipliers for their offense as long as they have those jobs. And so if you're not trying to fight fire with fire when you're dealing with these organizations and these coaches in the NFC North, then I think that you are going to consistently be left behind in the way that the Bears are right now.
So before we get to Ben Johnson, who I want to ask you about, are there, of the other offensive coordinators on the Bears list, they finished an interview today with Drew Petzing of the Cardinals, Liam Cohen of the Buccaneers is on the list, and Joe Brady from Buffalo is on the list. Of those three, have you heard or do you believe that any of them have the ability to be a head coach, have like the leadership skills, the communication styles, the ability to spin plates, that kind of ceiling? I don't know, and we need to do research ourselves to find out if any of those three, Petzing, Cohen, Brady, could actually do the head coach job as a personality perspective.
I always think it's hard to say, and I know that's a cop-out, but the jobs are so different that I think projecting those guys into the role, it goes beyond leadership. It's about how can you put a staff together, outlining accountability and being able to handle discipline over the course of an entire roster is different than when you're a coordinator and when you're not having to deal with stuff like that. I think there's always going to be some projection involved here. And I think that among those three, I think that Drew's done a very good job in Arizona, even if there are holes in what they've done. I think that Liam's background with Sean in LA and the success that we've seen from guys from that tree specifically, and what I've heard about the quality of the staff that he might put together, just independent of being in on those interviews and just what I know from the outside looking in, if I had to take a gamble on one of those three guys, it would probably be Liam. And I think one of the tiebreakers involved with Cohen and Brady is that Liam Cohen has a top 5 offense with Baker Mayfield. Joe Brady has a top 5 offense with Josh Allen. And I think one of those things is a little bit harder than the other.
Okay, very interesting. We'll file that away. Now on Ben Johnson, do you believe that he has the leadership skills and the abilities? It's still a projection as a leader, or do you feel like you know a little bit more about him from that perspective?
I think it absolutely is still a projection. I think that I'm fascinated by this idea this season, especially as you look at what's happened around the league. I think a lot of people are going to talk about culture and about how you change culture. And I think that people believe in order to do that, you have to find one of these like hardo football dudes that is a Dan Campbell or a Jim Harbaugh. But I've started to ask a lot of people about this just because I'm interested in the idea of what culture means in an NFL building. And I was in LA a couple of weeks ago talking to a bunch of guys on the Chargers about this. And when I was asking them about what football culture meant, none of them mentioned like being somebody who can give a rousing speech at the front of a locker room. No one talked about, how hard practices were. One of the words that came out of everybody's mouth was honesty. Are you going to be honest with me about expectations? Are you going to be clear about what you want this to be? And I think I said this yesterday. Being able to set those expectations, being somebody who lays things out clearly to players, being somebody who can communicate to players, I'm going to make the game easier on you in X, Y, and Z way. That to me is culture, in the same way that Mike Vrabel being a big, strong man at the front of the room is culture. And I think in a lot of those ways, Ben Johnson has shown an ability to have those things be a part of his offense and do it over a series of years with a quarterback that has distinct limitations. These are all bets. Every single one of these choices you are going to make has risks. It has downsides. You are making bets at the poker table on all of these. Ben Johnson and what he has done in Detroit feels like the bet that's worth making for the exact same thing that Lawrence said. No more half measures. Like, let's swing for the fence. Is there a lower floor with Ben Johnson than there is with Mike Vrabel? Absolutely there is. But the ceiling is high enough, and the ceiling is considerably higher than with some of these other guys, that I think it ultimately would be a risk worth taking.
Robert Mays of the Athletic Football Show joining us here on Spiegel and Holmes. You know this from me telling you, I'm so jealous of the relationship that you have with McVay. I love how you guys talk ball. I also think that it's interesting because you brought it up as far as like him getting coaches to move to that next step. He seems to want to be a coach developer. A lot of coaches talk about it. He's about it, including one of the guys that's on the staff here for the Bears. He's gone a long way to helping Thomas Brown, Kevin O'Connell, Liam Cohen, like this whole tree. He seems interested at getting his people to the next job. I think Bruce Arians was another guy that was big into that being a part of his whole thing as a head coach. I'd love to know, from what you know of McVay, why is this important to him, and how does he go about developing coaches?
I think personal development in general is important for Sean, and I think self-reflection is important for Sean. And I think if you want to, any human being wants to continue to progress in their career and in who they are as a person. And sometimes you need to get bigger opportunities in order for that to happen. And I think in terms of how he develops these guys, I don't necessarily know if there's like a playbook that happens. And there are some organizations that I know that they do have like personal improvement plans with coaches. Like, it's about intentional development and intentional personal growth. And they have actual mechanisms in place, whether it's, all right, you're going to be at the front of a meeting and you're going to do this. I don't know if LA necessarily has that stuff in place. I think the reason that Sean has had so much success in finding future head coaches is that what he looks for people on his staff is the same level of energy that he's going to bring to the job. This to me is a really good example. Their tight ends coach right now is a guy named Nick Caley. Nick had no connection to Sean before he went to work for him in LA. Nick was a lifetime Patriots guy. He grew up in that offensive system. When they moved on from Belichick and when they were tweaking some stuff over there, Nick got hired to be Sean's tight ends coach, and he's now the passing game coordinator. When you have a conversation with Nick, the energy he's bringing to that discussion, how invested he is in being somebody who loves ball and wants his players to improve, it feels like having a conversation with Sean. And I don't think it's because they work together. I think it's because he seeks out personality types that aligns with the way that he wants to operate.
Well, what I think is weird, and going back to like the things with the Bears, is that fair or not, I felt like in the hiring that the Bears did, that there was some fear in it. And that's the thing I kind of admire about McVay, Robert, is the idea that he is okay with being like, I'm hiring this guy because this guy has the potential to be a head coach. Where sometimes it feels like when I'm looking at the Bears and how they put their staff together, that they seem to be okay with, well, this guy's all right at the job that he has. And I'm not even talking about ambition. I'm talking about being able to see that someone's got that thing that's going to make them a head coach.
I also think that guys just inherently can get threatened by people who have potential and are rising stars. And I think that we underrate how much security and being self-assured and okay in who you are matters in being a head coach in the NFL. And I think that Sean has that in droves. Kevin Stefanski this year going out and being like, yeah, I'll have Mike Vrabel come into the building, even though I'm theoretically on the hot seat. There wasn't an ounce of Kevin Stefanski that was worried about what bringing Mike Vrabel into the building would do for his job security. And I don't think you can necessarily say that about all 32 head coaches in the league.
This is how we need to define the personal characteristics that we're looking for, because we saw it play out all year long with Eberflus in the negative way. But the honesty, the self-assurance. It's not that Dan Campbell is a tough guy talking about biting kneecaps. That's just, that's window dressing. That's an honest dude with the self-assurance to admit when he's wrong publicly and privately. And he's not freaked out that Aaron Glenn is strong, that Ben Johnson is strong, right? And Brad Holmes is not freaked out that Dan Campbell is strong. This is it's the honesty and it's the personal maturity. That's got to be there. And it was so woefully obvious that this Bears staff didn't have it all year long at all levels. It was insane to watch fall apart, wasn't it? Was it instructive to you to watch it fall apart?
I think it was. And I think that, this idea of Dan Campbell being the knee biter guy, I don't think that's the most important part of Dan Campbell's success, is this like tough guy football stuff. Again, going back to those conversations with the people in the Chargers locker room, it reminded me a little bit of discussions I've had with people about Mike Tomlin in the past. And when you talk to people about Mike Tomlin and just what that Steelers building feels like, when you're in a team meeting, if you play for the Pittsburgh Steelers, nobody's off limits. If there is somebody that is a star player who's not meeting the standard, they'll call you out in front of all 53 guys. And the same thing goes for the Chargers. I was talking to Khalil Mack 2 weeks ago, and he was saying, I've never been around a staff that will do that, where anybody can get called to the carpet in those moments. And the reason that becomes okay, tying it back into Dan Campbell, is that needs to be rooted in an understanding that the players know you also care about them. At the end of the day, the reason that they're able to do that is because they're coming back and saying, the reason I'm frustrated with this is I know what you can do. Here's an example of things going the right way. I want more for you, and that's why I'm willing to do this. And so accountability is important, but it also needs to be offset with an understanding that these coaches care about who these guys are as players.
This is why this guy is one of the best in the business. If you have not checked out the Athletic Football Show, do yourself a favor, and whether it's on YouTube or if you just want to have it as the podcast, start following it. It's amazing. And it's amazing because of this guy right here. Robert Mays, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
That's incredibly kind of you. I really, really appreciate it. Anytime. You guys know that. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Robert. Yeah, that's great. It's the personal stuff that we're trying to wrap words around, and he does it very, very well. I want to ask him about Brian Flores next time. I want to ask if Flores can pull back from where he went and what he's hearing from conversations.
Fair enough.